Okay, so I'm going to walk you through how I do the ECPH soil tests, and then I'm going to post another video of me actually doing a test. But this is just walking you through the steps to make sure you follow what was done. So yeah, how to measure soil pH? Obviously, a pH meter. EC, same thing, whatever. The three key methods that exist in horticulture are the 1:2 dilution method, the pour through method. Notice the American truncated spelling. Saturated media extraction method. So they're slightly different variations of the same theme, and they have their different advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to walk you through them. Looking at the 1:2 dilution, uh, interestingly, there's a picture of an ice cream scoop here. No kidding, this actually is a popular method for getting soil samples to do a 1:2 dilution. Basically, you obtain a sample from often multiple pots, so that makes this method a little more accurate, and also makes this method useful for very large pots where you can't take the entire pot and run water through. You want to collect some samples. So you're going to scoop out soil from several pots and combine them into one volume. And typically you want to avoid the top 2 centimeters of soil. That is primarily because the top couple of centimeters of your pot is the evaporation zone, where if this is your pot, right, and you're adding your nutrient solution, as water evaporates from the surface, it leaves behind concentrated salts in that top layer. So you have an artificially high EC, so it's not accurate. And most of the time, the plant's roots, if this is your plant, the plant's roots are around the bottom 2/3 of the pot. You know, the top part here isn't used as often. That doesn't mean it's never used. Some plants that root aggressively will root out the entire pot. But generally speaking, avoid the top couple of centimeters to not get an overestimate of the EC. So place the sample into a measured container. All right, so we want to roughly have an idea of about 100 milliliters of volume. So it doesn't have to be that, but record the volume. That's important. So let's say you have 100 milliliters of soil. Pour that into a larger container that will accommodate water. Add 100 milliliters or the same volume of water. Now, deionized is preferential. Distilled water is fine. All things being equal, if it really matters, if it really is okay to use city water, if you have to. Not everyone has access to deionized water or distilled water. It's actually not the end of the world. What's most important is that what you do is you take a sample of city water and you measure the EC of the city water. And you should really measure the pH. Typically, city water is close to 7, and that way you can correct for what comes out the pot. Now, pH wise, it's not very accurate. I'll be honest. The city water tends to be have bicarbonates, which will buffer the pH. So you'll have the pH will be higher than it actually is in the pot coming out into your dilution. But as far as the EC is concerned, if you stick an EC meter in the city water and you have an EC of 0.01, then all you do is subtract that from your final EC. So whatever EC is contributing from the water you're adding is then subtracted from the total EC at the other end. But in all sincerity, your best bet is to buy deionized or distilled water. I have used very successfully bottled water, just bottled water from the grocery store. It's pretty much clean. There's a little bit of mineral added to it, but you can take the EC on it. You'll find it's well below the resolution we're looking at for horticulture. So it's inexpensive and readily available. Okay, so then you're going to add the same volume of water and you let it sit. I think it's a bit excessive, 15 minutes, but sure, let it sit for quite a while to stabilize, and then you can measure your pH. Now, some people will tell you to sit and let it sit for like an hour or something. I think that's a bit crazy. Ionic movement is very rapid. The reality is most of the time you can get away with an almost instantaneous reading. I would encourage you, if you actually have a meter and you try to reproduce this at home, not everyone has access to this stuff, but some of you might have hydroponics at home, do some experiments and measure pH every 5 minutes, and you'll see it stabilizes fairly quickly. Now, some pH meters actually drift nonstop, so be careful with that. The rule of thumb in general with all of this is to be consistent, because we're looking for trends. We're not looking for precision, we're looking for trends, right? So if every time you sample the same way and you see the pH is changing over time, that's a trend. That gives you information as a grower. Maybe you don't care if it's pH of 5.7 or 5.8, but if you know it's going from 5.6 to 5.7 to 5.8 every other day, you know you have a problem. So you let it stand, then take your measure, measure the pH by just jamming your probe into that slurry. Sometimes people will slip a coffee filter over top of it. I think that's a bit tricky. Just carefully insert your probe. Make sure there's no air bubbles trapped in it so you don't get a poor reading. Gently sort of shake and wiggle it as it goes into the slurry. So again, note the pH is done with a 1-to-1 dilution with your distilled water. After that, you're going to go back and add another same volume of water. So now it's 2-to-1, and let it stand for a few minutes. And then you're going to measure your electrical conductivity. By the same thing, jamming it into the slurry and getting your EC. So EC is done at 2-to-1 in this particular format. The pour-through method involves taking your pot, placing it over a tray, and putting enough water into the pot to displace some out the bottom. Usually you just want enough to be able to submerge your probe into it. If you put a ton of water and wash it in through and you have half a bucket of water, it's all dilute. You know, your ECs are going to be way too low and your pH will be quite different as well. So we want to keep adding water to the surface of the pot till it drips out the bottom enough to submerge your probe. The picture on this slide shows a fairly large volume of water. I would say actually a quarter of that is enough, just enough to submerge your probe, right? The key here is we want to saturate the media, okay? So that means that when you're doing a pour through, as you're pouring your distilled water or whatever you're using over the pot, you need to pour it evenly over the entire surface. Don't just put it in one spot and just keep pouring. The idea is you want the water to move through the column of the pot evenly so that it's pulling out the salt ions from the entire root zone. Otherwise, you'll end up with an inaccurate result. Wait till it stops dripping, and then basically place it over a non-metal collection area. You need about 50 milliliters to submerge a probe typically. So that leach is what you're going to measure. Collect it, jam your EC pH pen into that, and get your reading, and away you go. The pour-through method works fantastically for pots up to about 8 or 10 inches in diameter. When you start getting bigger than that, pour-through becomes very difficult, and it's easier to reach down into the root zone and take soil samples and do 2-to-1 or do this method, the saturated media extraction. In this case, you're going to remove some soil from the root zone, right? So place it into a beaker, a lot like the 1-to-2 dilution. Add your water for the test until it's completely saturated and wet. Let it stand again for anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And then, interesting here, wearing gloves. Why is that? Because your hands have salt on them from your sweat. So that will increase the EC reading that you get. So gloves is a good idea, or just wash your hands thoroughly with fresh water before you do it and you'll be fine. And then directly measure the EC and pH. So the SME method is very convenient. It's easy to do for large scale pots. I'm thinking of things like cannabis facilities that are growing with very large pots. It's often just easier to do an SME, or for example, a tree nursery where you're dealing with large root balls. Or if you're doing vegetable gardening in the field, you can't do a pour through there. You're going to have to dig down and take soil samples at different plants to see what's going on. So SME is quick, 1-to-2 dilution, a little slower. It's important to be consistent. Whichever method you choose, you need to stick with it, right? And what this chart is showing is that the values that you get from the different methods differ, in some cases substantially. So you don't switch up what methods you're using, you stay consistent and you look for trends. So with the, where are we here? Let me get my eraser. So with the 1 to 2 dilution, the fact that it's a dilution means that your EC numbers are going to be low, right? So they're going to underreport. So in the middle here, we have normal ranges for most plants. So with a 1 to 2 dilution, you're looking at a 0.8 to 1.3 millisiemens per centimeter, or EC, is normal. Where with the SME, you're looking at 2 to 3.5, and pour through anywhere from 2.5 to 4.6. So the pour through is the highest, the SME is intermediate, and the 1 to 2 is the lowest. When you think about it, it makes sense based on the different methodologies. The SME is taking a smaller volume of soil. The 1 to 2 is using excess water, which dilutes it. And the pour through is collecting ions from the entire root zone. So you get a concentrated amount of ions. So it's easy to see how the three methods would produce different results.